One spilled coin. That's how it starts for many of these stories, an ordinary, almost forgettable slip of metal on a city sidewalk that in the wrong hands turns into a map. 3 people told their stories to be heard. A college performer whose life orbited small theaters and late-night runs for coffee and bagels. A woman who drove home from a pharmacy and found a presence waiting for her like a shadow you could not outrun. And a tenant who found evidence someone had walked through her apartment while she slept, then realized the person with access was closer than anyone guessed. Each account begins with something ordinary and ends in a slow, living dread that never quite leaves. These are their voices. These are what happened. We should say it now. The stories that follow include stalking and harassment. They are true testimonies from survivors who thought it would never happen to them. If any details feel familiar, or if this touches something in you, listen gently to what your body tells you and reach out to someone you trust. She was studying theater at a state college, small programs and smaller stages, the kind of place where everyone knows your shoe size and your go-to coffee order. Her days ran on routines, classes, rehearsal, late-night study sessions, then the ritual stop at the bagel shop on the corner. It was a place with a bell over the door and a chalkboard menu that never seemed to match the weather outside. They knew her order before she asked. Plain bagel, everything but the sesame, an iced coffee unless it was raining. People there learned your rhythm. It made the city feel smaller, kinder, safer. That's why the coin mattered. One slow Thursday in November, she was juggling a backpack and a stack of flyers for an upcoming student production. Change spilled from a pocket. A scattering of copper and silver hit the sidewalk like rain. He, an employee behind the counter, bent down to help. His voice was polite, the kind of ordinary friendliness you expect in a service job. He handed her coins, smiled, and slipped a napkin note into the bagel box, as if it was something simple and harmless. She remembers the smallness of the moment, the scrape of coin against concrete, the warmth of the coffee in her hand, and the tiny tremor in the note, an extra line of ink that made the exchange feel like a scene in a play. She left, waves of rehearsal and midterms pressing in, and she did what most people do when someone is friendly. She thanked him. She didn't notice anything else. Not yet. Weeks passed. His attention materialized the way an echo does, distant at first, then growing louder each time you failed to ignore it. He found her online. It began with follows. An account that liked a photo of her in a costume, another that commented on a behind-the-scenes clip. Then messages arrived, brief, insistent, affectionate, without context. Nice show tonight. You were great. Ordinary, until they weren't. When she blocked him, he reappeared as several new accounts. He spammed likes on old posts from months ago, liked pictures of friends, created accounts with slight variations of usernames. Social platforms that once felt like a way to celebrate work and keep in touch became a labyrinth she couldn't exit. She told one friend, "He keeps messaging me," she said, "the way everyone says something small and expects it to be small." Her friend tried to shrug it off. Some people are needy, some people misread politeness. The friend suggested she not reply. That made sense. It was reasonable. But the messages kept coming. The content shifted from compliments to an insistence on proximity. Did you see the cast list? Where's the theater located? When is your next show? It's easy to convince yourself you're overreacting. It's a mental safety valve. Maybe he's just enthusiastic. Maybe this is awkward but harmless. Everybody wants to believe in the ordinary. The escalation moved from the glowing rectangle of her phone to the world around her. He found the theater address after a cast photo tagged a location. He started showing up at places the cast would talk about in passing. A post about a rehearsal, a comment about where to meet for coffee. Once, after a night rehearsal, she found muddy handprints on her car window. The marks were faint under the street lamp, like smudged crescents that anyone could dismiss as those of a careless pedestrian, except they weren't random. They were deliberate, placed where she would see them when she left the building. Rehearsal nights became exercises in looking over shoulders. She kept expecting to catch someone obvious, a lanky figure behind a telephone pole, a shadow that turned when she spun around. Instead, he accomplished the more dangerous thing. He became a ghost inside routine. He learned her schedule through pieces of public information. He listened to other students complain about late nights and used those details like coordinates. He left small signs that seemed almost apologetic. A single wilted flower on the step where she met her castmates. A folded note tucked into the props crate that said only, "Be patient." She kept that note in a drawer for months. She didn't read it aloud to friends. She tucked it into a shoebox of crayons and kept going to rehearsals. Because how do you stop your education and your life for a person who has no legal reason to be present? How do you tell people your comfort has been violated by someone whose offense, in the beginning, registers as awkwardness rather than crime? Then came the night of the show she directed. It was a small production. The theatre smelled of dust and hairspray and the kind of cleaner that promises things will be okay. She had fought for this role, for the staging, for every line. Backstage was chaos in a way that felt like home. Makeup kits open, scripts taped to mirrors. Someone swearing softly because a seam popped. She moved through it all with practice steps, hairspray in one hand, a cup of coffee gone cold on a set list. After the curtain call, they lingered at the stage door, old habits, old traditions. The cast waiting for last words, congratulatory hugs, the rustle of coats as the theatre emptied. He was there, at the edge of the crowd, where the light pooled less brightly. He held flowers, not a bouquet so much as a single stem wrapped in plastic, a gesture meant to look harmless and sentimental in the blur of applause. He stood too still. She had the outerwear of normalcy. She had lines to say and contracts to meet. But her heart knew, an abrupt animal knowledge, that this was not normal. She felt it like a pressure behind the sternum. She remembered pulling her jacket tighter, scanning for a friendly face. Finn, the head stage manager, saw him first. Finn is the kind of person who reads the room, efficient, blunt, protective, in a way actors trust. Finn stepped forward, voice calm but firm, and asked the man to move back. The man smiled in the way a person smiles when they think they are obeying a script, polite, rehearsed, but something in his eyes stayed like glass. He followed her to her car. She didn't notice at first. Even menace can be quiet in the shadow of adrenaline. She locked doors, sat for a beat, and then saw the press of palms on the opposite glass. 2 fingerprints, their shapes clear and accusing against the fogged surface. He left the flowers on the windshield with a folded note that read only a few words. "I'm being patient." A phrase so blank, yet so full. A promise of things to come. Finn called the director and theatre staff. Together, they made a choice: ban him from the premises. They voided his tickets for the remaining run. They called the police. The theatre's decision felt like relief. An institutional validation in a landscape that so often minimizes. When management finally steps in, it changes how people see what happened. It doesn't erase it, but it marks a line. She filed reports. She went to the police station with Finn at her side. The officer took the statement, recorded dates and phone numbers and screenshots. He used language that was clinical, harassment, following, and checked boxes that somehow converted terror into paperwork. The legal steps were forward-moving acts, but they did not make the fear vanish. Restraining orders are edges drawn on paper. They do not erase the time a stranger waited for you beneath a street lamp. She learned to answer the door only with the chain on. She changed routes home. She slept with the lights on more nights than not. There's a strange aftertaste to validation. On the one hand, the ban and the officer's notes felt like armor. Theatre staff alerted the front of house and would call if the man returned. On the other hand, their intervention made the reality sharper. Someone had found her, assembled online breadcrumbs into a map, and used those breadcrumbs to appear where she worked and where she left each night. A platform notification that once meant a friend had liked a rehearsal picture now felt like a warning. She remembers the long-term changes in the simplest terms. She stopped posting locations. She blurred tags and scrubbed comments. She refused the casuality of public check-ins. She stopped assuming a good deed would be read as one. Her audition videos no longer carried a tag for the small theatre she loved. She cancelled a family weekend trip because the man had once said, in a message that was quoted by the detectives only as, "I can't stop thinking about you," that he knew where she liked to sit. The phrase lodged itself under her ribs like a splinter. What followed legally was partial closure, ban enforced, voided tickets, a restraining order application initiated. But the psychological scars did not file away as neatly as case numbers. Sleep became punctuated by small alarms, the sound of footsteps that weren't there, a rush of sweat when a van idled too long at a corner, the reflexive tightening of hands at night. She left theatre later than she wanted to, or earlier. She rehearsed escape routes in her head, despite knowing she'd rehearsed stage exits for years. Those new routines are a form of survival. She learned to measure freedom in steps avoided. Vin kept an old Polaroid behind the stage's lighting ladder of the cast at opening night. In the picture, she looks laughing, mid-sentence, hair pulled back in a messy bun. The photo saved her memory of herself before fear took a long-term lease. She kept it in a drawer in case she needed proof to remember who she had been. When the story spread among her circle, people used their own language of comfort. You did the right thing. You were brave. But the truth of bravery here is messy. It is knitting your life back together and continuing to work with scenes of romantic tension because that's your craft, even while your chest tightens when someone calls your name in public. Her college offered counseling. The theatre arranged an awareness briefing. Finn taught a small workshop for stagehands about identifying and de-escalating potential threats. The policy changes were real and necessary, and not universal solutions. This was the kind of stalking that married the public square to the private. A polite encounter in a bagel shop collapses into DMs and account recreations. The digital laundry list of follows and likes becomes a set of footsteps behind your exit door. The man's gestures were never romantic in the way movies misrepresent obsession. They were violations that grew like a bruise. He was banned. Legal measures were taken. Still, the mark remained, an ongoing sensitivity to the soft edges of the world. She kept the single stem he left. It was pressed between pages in a script she returned to on months when courage felt thin. Sometimes she would take it out and feel the brittle paper smell nothing but ink. To her, the stem became a symbol of the thin line between a harmless courtesy and persistent trespass. She sometimes thought of the coin he had handed back on that November day and how quickly a single small act can be misread as permission. "This was the kind of person who learned how to be where I was," she said in a statement to a friend later, voice steady but tired. "He built his route from the crumbs we leave online." That line, "crumbs we leave online," haunts anyone who treats the internet as nothing more than a harmless echo of daily life. People who love performance will always have some pieces of themselves online, and those pieces are discoverable. She didn't want to be defined by fear, neither did the theatre, so they set new practices. They asked cast members not to share precise guild details, to avoid geotags, to change the ways they announced meetups. Those were precautions, and to the survivor, bitter necessities. The life she loved continued, but with a shadow just out of frame. That's the paradox. Validation and institutional response can help, but they don't rebuild the innocence stolen by persistence. If you follow the digital trail of this story, you can see how a casual touch becomes a pattern. He moved from service smile to online mimicry to physical presence. At every stage, other people had choices: to see, to intervene, to believe, to write it off. The theatre did the visible, tangible thing. They stood with her. Law enforcement logged it. These are rare comforts. Often, the going is lonelier. And yet there is no tidy cinematic moment where everything is closed. Bans and orders can be enforced or ignored. Restraining orders can be violated. The man did not vanish into a final page of court documents in her telling. The story closed on a partial victory, ticket voicings voided, theatre attendance blocked, legal steps taken, and a cast that watched one another's backs. The cost was in the sleepless nights and the new measures of safety, small sacrifices for a life rebuilt on different terms. If this account reads like an indictment of one person, it is also an indictment of the way small gestures in public can be weaponized when combined with the modern reach of social media. The theatre's intervention matters because it shows that institutional action can validate and protect. But the story also asks a harder question. How often do institutions fail to see what is right in front of them? Her case ended with some immediate protections. Not all victims are granted that even after reporting. If you're hearing this and feeling a ripple of recognition, if you have a friend who stopped posting locations or someone who started answering the door with a chain on, stay with them. Hear them. Ask not for proof, but for trust. Normalizing the small early signs could be the difference between a worry and a nightmare. If you find this gripping, like and subscribe for more. It helps these voices reach others who may need them. The city has a way of making late-night errands feel ordinary. The second story begins in that ordinary space. A cold street, fluorescent pharmacy lights bleeding onto the curb, a car that slows because a figure is standing where someone shouldn't be. She was coming back from buying medicine for a sore throat, the kind of mundane errand that anchors you in real life. The road was quiet. Northern Irish streets in late winter have a damp hush, the kind that swallows sound and creates a small world of headlights and muffled footsteps. She drove past the pharmacy and saw the silhouette, a man in black, his posture deliberate, as if he had paused to measure the distance between himself and the storefront. He wore gloves, leather that caught the glow, and he didn't move with the distracted pace of someone waiting for a bus. He stood like an actor on a stage, still and deliberate. She felt the prickle on the back of her neck and slowed. Rational explanations crowded the space. Maybe he was homeless. Maybe he was a worker taking a smoke break. But the hands in gloves were a visual punctuation. Too careful, too rehearsed. She chose not to stop. Some part of her thought stopping might escalate rather than resolve. She turned onto her street and, for a few blocks, told herself she had done the right thing. Then, a few minutes later, she saw him again. In the rear view, a dark figure slid past a fence line opposite her house. He was walking the same direction she had just taken out of the pharmacy's parking lot. An instinct tightened her jaw like a drawstring. She told herself to breathe. She pulled into her driveway, the gravel crunching under tires, and reached for the deadbolt as if her hands had rehearsed it all night. When she unlocked the front door, she found nothing. The inside smelled of laundry detergent and a dinner she hadn't cooked. She put her keys down on the hallway table and tried to push away the twitchy, ridiculous fear of being watched. She called a friend and spoke in short sentences, laughing too quickly at small jokes to keep from bothering the silence. Night settled in with the kind of slow hands that make seconds feel long. She checked the curtains once, twice. She left a light on. She told herself she was being fanciful. The thing about being watched, though, is that it makes you feel as if you're in a play where everyone else forgot their lines. Ordinary actions, locking up, checking windows, turn into acts of theatre meant to convince yourself that you are safe. At 3:30 a.m., she woke to a sound that was small and impossible to name, a humming thin and steady, as if someone were testing the low keys of a piano. The sound threaded the night like a needle. For a moment she thought the heater was making an odd noise, or that a neighbor had left something on. But then she realized the humming was outside. It had a rhythm that a human throat alone could hold. It stopped when she pressed her forehead to the glass. She saw a shape at the far side of the garden, by the rectangular window that looked into the spare room. He had moved closer. He was in black. He stood with gloved hands pressed flat against the glass, palms splayed, as if feeling the temperature through the pane. One hand slid up to shield his eyes, in a way that made nothing hidden, gloved fingers hugging the cheekbones like a frame. He smiled without sound. She called emergency services. The line felt antiseptic and slow. She told the operator what she saw, and between sentences realized she could not find the words for the thinness of her panic. When the police arrived, their lights painted the street with blue and red. The sound of the engine felt briefly like salvation. Officers moved with procedure, testing doors, peering into yards, talking with neighbors. They found evidence of forced entry at the pharmacy, glass scratched, a lock compromised, and they took notes. They didn't find him. They could show the damage to the pharmacy door, file the reports, log the statement. They could not private guard the night forever. She slept very little after that, and when she did, dreams placed him at windows, humming. Parking by the pharmacy became an exercise in scanning and escape routes. The place where she had once grabbed a midweek cough syrup became a marker she drove past with quickened breath. The sense of security linked to errand running evaporated. The man's presence had turned the world into a narrower, more careful space. This story has no tidy legal end in the telling I have. The police found signs of entry, but not the person who had stood by the window. The missing link, his absence, made the fear both concrete and unmoored. She started taking different routes home at night, but even daytime brought leftover worry. A stranger loitering in the wrong place was not a random act, but a possibility of pattern. You can patch your life with actions and alarms, but you cannot stitch back the certainty that you once had. That was the way the second story threaded its way into the city. Ordinary errands, a man who had learned how to position himself between public space and private rooms. The rest of her nights were scored by cautious breathing and the police's reassurances that they would patrol the area more often. It helped, but the humming lodged itself like a small, frightening memory in the house itself. One that would unspool in the quiet moments long after they said the word case and closed the folder on the desk. She began to notice all the little ways houses feel exposed, the squeak of a gate hinge, a loose fence board rattling like someone's breath. She told close friends, and they tried to be practical, security, cameras, different routes. But those are measures you take into a world already altered. Her voice, when she described the man, was calm on the phone, practiced to keep a friend from becoming alarmed. She used measured words because the alternative, panic, was the only thing she feared more than the man whose silhouette had become a permanent notch of anxiety. When we think of stalkers, we imagine filmic chases, a sudden leap from shadow to assault. That does happen in other cases, and we should not minimize it. But often stalking looks like repositioning, the quiet step from public to private, the use of telescoped hours designed to teach you are not alone even when you are. The man outside the pharmacy never had to do more than be where she might pass by. The fear that turns ordinary errands into safety calculations is itself a harm, almost a theft of time and trust. And that's where we leave the second account for now. On the edge of a live search, a police notebook half full, the humming that refuses to be simply a sound. There are more details to tell, about the officer's search, about the shakiness of light in the street after the patrol car's red glow fades. But those belong to the next moment, when we pick up the trail again and see how the presence at the window echoes into other parts of a life. Before we continue, hold this image. From a spilled coin to a door left ajar, small acts trust us into vulnerability. Each of these stories is a warning that the ordinary can conceal a threat that grows carefully, from a polite exchange into a pattern that isolates and terrifies. The narratives overlap in one hard lesson. Proximity does not always come from people you can name. It can creep in through a like on your feed or a footprint by your door. They are not hyperbole. They are how these survivors learn to measure the world. Next, there is a story that starts with subtle domestic disruptions and escalates into proof. Tape at thresholds, muddy footprints that belong to no visitor she invited, and a breach that eventually leads to an arrest, but not without a long period of dismissal and doubt from those who should have believed her. That story begins in an apartment building where entry is supposed to be controlled by those who work there, where keys are privileges that can be abused if there is no oversight. The tenant thought the oddities were accidents. She was wrong. She was wrong. At first it was easy to explain each small thing away. An ice melt smear on the hallway runner, a scuff on the kitchen tile she assumed a delivery person left, a water jug left open on the counter as if someone had used it and forgotten to close it. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building with thin walls and a creaky heating system. Ordinary excuses fit into those ordinary gaps. She told herself she was being hypersensitive. She told friends she was tired. They told her to breathe. The oddities arrived in a pattern that looked accidental until you stepped back and saw the sequence. A muddy footprint on the living room carpet on a morning when she'd been out all night. A cupboard left slightly ajar. A small smear of dirt across a windowsill. She bought an inexpensive roll of tape and on a whim one morning before work placed a single thin strip across the doorframe where the door met the threshold. She expected to find the tape undisturbed at the end of the day, a minor thing to prove nothing. Instead, when she came home, the edge of the tape had been lifted and retaped with a faint dust line through the adhesive. Some small, deliberate disturbance, almost like curiosity. She did something she had never done before. She started cataloguing. She began a notebook with dates and times and small observations. Jan 2, 12, muddy print by couch. Jan. 14, water jug open. Jan. 15, tape moved. A friend suggested cameras. Her landlord suggested it might be rodents. The leasing office put her concerns on a low-priority maintenance list. "We'll send someone to check the drainage," the manager said. "Could be a leak, could be condensation." Their words were polite and procedural, and not the language fear wants. Fear wants validation. The tape, once disturbed twice more, became proof she could hold. She began to use it like a measurement tool, simple and quiet. Tape across the bedroom door at night, a strip across the kitchen pantry, a thread across the closet latch. Each morning she recorded whether the tape had been moved. It was an absurd domestic ritual, part science project, part séance, yet the results were consistent enough to compel action. The tape told a story of someone entering when she wasn't home. One afternoon, she found a knife drawer she never opened pulled out, and a jar she kept full of coins knocked to the floor. She had an uneasy feeling in her chest, a low, curling heat that sat behind her breastbone. She took photos on her phone, hands that shook slightly as she tried to focus with a camera that insisted on finding peace in the blur. She brought the photos to the leasing office. "Someone's been in my apartment," she said, handing them the images like evidence in a small trial. The office manager looked at the photos and made a face as if balancing the expense of an accusation against the cost of a maintenance call. "We'll increase patrols," they said. "Make sure you lock your door." The suggestion felt thin, an institutional shrug translated into language meant to soothe. She left the office with a polite smile she did not feel. The intrusions continued. Footprints on the rug, a hair tie she kept on the bathroom sink repositioned, an extra spoon in the cutlery drawer. She began leaving notes. When she returned from work one evening, she found a sticky note under a coffee mug that read, in uneven handwriting, "Nice place." The note landed like a weight. She called the police and filed a report. Officers came, took the statement and asked careful questions. Did she suspect anyone? Did she have any enemies? Had she noticed anyone loitering? She had her tape logs and a swelling stack of photos. They entered it all into the system. "We'll look into it," they promised. It was an action that felt good on an emotional ledger, an official nod that the situation was not imaginary. Then the theft happened. It was not dramatic in a cinematic way, no forced entry, no dramatic confrontation. It was subtle and humiliating. A laptop missing from her desk, a phone she always kept in a drawer gone. The things were not expensive by some standards, but they were personal, the implements of a life. Letters, a hard drive with photos from a year earlier, a passport she had tucked away in a bedside drawer. The absence landed with a sound like shattering glass. She felt exposed in an intimate way, as if someone had rifled through the privacy of her life and made a tidy selection of things only someone with easy access would know to take. She called the police again. This time the tone was different. Theft is a clearer crime than oddities, and after the third call they could no longer file it under "we'll watch." They brought evidence bags. They dusted for prints with polite, focused motions that made their hands look like instruments of possibility. The investigator who sat across from her that night, he wore a jacket that smelled faintly of coffee and a calm that was practiced, asked whether she suspected anyone from the building. The question had weight. No one wants to accuse their neighbors, but it also had logic. The pattern indicated access. Neighbors began to speak up. A woman from the floor below admitted she'd heard noises at odd hours. Another tenant mentioned finding a window ajar that should have been latched. A former resident, contacted through a mutual acquaintance, said she had never trusted the maintenance staff because keys seemed to go missing in vague ways. Rumors surfaced like small lights in a dark room. What the investigators eventually found was the kind of mundane betrayal that cuts deeper because of its simplicity. A set of keys, a history of access, a person in a position meant to protect the building who could, in fact, wander units. A maintenance worker, trusted to keep doors functioning, to change filters, to be the presence tenants counted on, had access to hundreds of small privacies. He worked hours that overlapped with different tenants' schedules. People had seen him in the hallways and nodded. You sign a paper to let a worker in. You hand over a key in the name of service. The arrest itself came much later. In the months after the theft, the investigation widened. Patterns emerged. Similar reports at nearby complexes, discrepancies in the maintenance logs, surveillance footage from a neighboring building that caught a figure in a sweater moving between halls at odd hours. The police connected dots. They executed a search warrant at the maintenance office, seized keys, and found items traced to multiple apartments. The man was arrested and later charged in relation to a string of break-ins and intrusions. For the tenant, the moment the news reached her life had a curious unmooring, vindication mixed with a complex grief. There was relief that the person with keys was no longer working the floors, and there was the recognition that trust had been traded for access. The legal process took its slow and messy path. Cases were filed, courts processed paperwork, the maintenance worker was dismissed. He was charged, and then his status moved through the system. That official arc, firing, arrest, charges, closed a procedural loop that the tenant had been asking for since the first tape was lifted. But it did not unpick the nights she counted footprints across her carpet. It did not restore the feeling that her home was simply her own. Post-arrest life had new practical steps. Better locks installed, community meetings with the property manager, a new protocol for key control. The building set up additional checks, logging key use, changing policies on who could enter when, a tightening of oversight. Those measures were real and necessary. They were also late. She had lived for months inside an erosion of privacy. The emotional recovery was quieter and longer. She found herself double-checking doors at restaurants, not because she feared the staff, but because the act of locking felt like a small shield. She started sleeping with a bedside lamp on for years. The ritual of checking the tape every morning turned into a ritual of perpetual vigilance until she consciously tried to unlearn it. She went to counseling to talk about the small panics that would come. A sudden fear when a janitor lingered a bit too long near the elevator, a flush of adrenaline when she heard keys jangle in a building hallway. These reactions were not irrational. They were accurate calibrations to what had happened. There were practical gains and personal losses. The police log, the arrest record, the firing, these items were proof that the world could respond. But they also demonstrated a gap. The time between suspicion and action had been long enough for trust to fracture. The community meetings helped tenants feel safer. Still, the tenant herself moved 2 years later to another building. She did not do it out of a sense of failure, but because the apartment's walls contained too many memories of being watched. The new apartment came with new locks and a renewed sense of solitude she had to build into a form that felt like home. Years later, when she told the story, she kept returning to one image. The tape across the threshold, its edge partially lifted, that tiny, translucent line that proved entry. She said plainly, "That bit of tape was more than tape. It was my proof that my home had been crossed." The line resonates because it reframes the intangible into the tangible, a small domestic act that transforms suspicion into evidence. It's a reminder that sometimes the only way to be believed is to make the invisible visible. All three women in these accounts share a strange kinship, an ordinary life made precarious by someone who learned enough to step across a threshold, digital or physical, and refused to accept the boundary. The first story ends with a man leaving flowers and a terse note at a theater. The second leaves a woman awake at 3:30 a.m., listening to a hum outside her window. The third closes with an arrest that explains a season of invasion, but never entirely restores the sense of automatic safety. Each story is, at its heart, a story of proximity. How someone can move from being a face in the city to a presence in your evenings. Beyond the immediate acts, what lingers is the institutional arc in each case. Sometimes a business steps up, as the theater did. Sometimes police find evidence but not a suspect, as in the pharmacy case. Sometimes a leasing office brushes off concerns until theft forces acknowledgement. These responses matter because they shape a survivor's experience of credibility and safety. Institutional action can be lifeline or delay. In the first story, the theater's ban made a practical difference and offered a sense of solidarity. In the second, the police investigation produced paperwork and patrols, but not a court man. In the third, evidence and neighbor corroboration eventually led to an arrest, but only after months of disbelief. There are quieter consequences too, the day-to-day recalibrations that survivors make in how they inhabit ordinary life. They stop posting precise locations. They change their routes home. They install extra locks. They sleep with a lamp on. These are not dramatic solutions so much as adaptations, small compromises to feel safe enough to keep moving forward. Friends and colleagues may call these acts sensible. Survivors call them survival. They are functional and sorrowful, the acceptance that life now contains new boundaries drawn by fear. We should not romanticize the stalker's presence. None of these narratives frames obsession as affection. Instead, what we see is repeated. Attention weaponized into pursuit, polite gestures converted into trespass, and platforms designed to connect becoming tools for mapping someone's life. The stories show the modern architecture of privacy invasion, the way a comment, a follow, a photo tag becomes a breadcrumb trail. Yet they also show the small successes of community and procedure, a stage manager who stepped in, a police officer who took notes and sought evidence at a pharmacy, neighbors who finally spoke up. Those responses are crucial because they signal that there are lines people will enforce. Validation, being believed, matters not because it magically erases fear, but because it acknowledges what happened and allows action to follow. Institutional validation was never a cure. It was a necessary balm and a tool. What remains, unarguably, is the psychological residuum, the tremor of vigilance. Each survivor carries a piece of their life rearranged. The performer still keeps the Polaroid backstage to remind herself of the person she was before worry moved in. The woman in Northern Ireland cannot quite forget the thin hum at 3:30 a.m., the memory that replays when she passes the pharmacy that used to be ordinary. The tenant kept the photos of lifted tape, of footprints, of the empty drawer. She uses them as pragmatic tools to explain and to remember. If there is a lasting image that ties all three stories together, it is small and domestic. A single stem pressed between pages, a pair of prints fogged on glass, a strip of tape half peeled from a doorframe. These are not sensational props. They are the residue of contact. They are proof that intimacies can be violated in the most mundane ways. They are also reminders that when institutions, neighbors, and friends choose to act, they can change the arc of someone's life. Stories like these are hard because they teach a fragile lesson. Safety is often an accumulation of small protections, and those protections require others to believe and to act. The danger in all three is how ordinary it begins. A coin, a silhouette outside a shop, a cup left open, and how quickly ordinary gestures can compound into patterns that monopolize a life. The survivor's courage is not only in the moments they called police or filed reports, it is in the quiet decision to keep living, to return to rehearsal, to shop for medicine, to sleep somewhere you feel safe enough to rest. Their courage is lived out in small, recurring acts of reclaiming space. There is no tidy, universally applicable playbook here. Each case had different outcomes: a ban and restraining order steps, a police search that found forced entry but not the person, and an arrest that eventually explained months of breach. The variety of endings is itself a warning. Sometimes justice arrives swiftly, sometimes slowly, sometimes not at all. The consistent variable is not the outcome, but the experience, the isolation, the fear, the need for validation. If anything can be taken from these narratives, it is this: listen to someone whose voice tightens when they describe being watched. Do not ask for perfect proof before offering help. If a friend freezes at the mention of a figure loitering near a shop, believe the tremor. If a neighbor reports a tape disturbed at the threshold, take note. Institutional response matters, but so does human attention. A theater manager's decision to ban a problematic patron, a police officer taking a careful report, a neighbor offering to walk someone to their car. These are not grand acts, but they have teeth. These stories are also a reminder to treat the digital world with a new sense of gravity. Photos and tags are not harmless. They can map someone's rhythms. The first survivor's choice to scrub geotags and blur locations is not paranoia, but a practical boundary. The modern stalker uses both online footprints and physical proximity to assemble access, understanding that connection changes how we think about safety. Finally, the residue of these experiences lives in small things: a photograph tucked into a drawer, a lamp left on in the bedroom, a Polaroid kept behind a stage ladder. They are keepsakes of survival. They are reminders that life can continue despite being marked by fear. If this collection of stories has left you with a feeling, unease, recognition, care, then it has done a difficult but important thing. It has honored voices that rarely make it to the foreground. If you have experienced anything like these accounts, please consider sharing your story in the comments below. Your experience matters, and the community here can be a place of listening and support. If you want to understand more about how institutions respond and how people find validation and support, watch the related video next. It examines police responses and community measures in greater detail. These are true stories that do not end neatly. They leave traces, pressings on glass, a hum in the night, a strip of tape, and they leave lessons about how close danger can be and how vital it is that we listen, act and believe when someone says they feel watched.